There be a storm a-brewin'.
Torrents, tempest, floods, oh my. On today's episode, ancient flood myths from around the world. Hey-o, trippers! Welcome to another episode of the Road Tripping Podcast. I'm your host, Dean Ward. If this is your first episode, then welcome. If it's not your first episode, then welcome back. Today's going to be a little different as I must stay out of the HOV lane as I don't have my +1. You see, Molly's out taking care of business things and can't join me today, so we're going to have another segment of Dean's Roadside Tales, in which I will strive to both enlighten and entertain you in the hopes that I can make your commute suck just a little less. As always, all previous episodes of the Road Tripping Podcast can be found for free on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and now even Amazon Music. Basically, wherever you prefer to download or stream your content, you can find us. If you have trouble, though, finding us within your app, just check out the subscribe link on our homepage at theroadtrippingpodcast.com. That's tripping with a G, and you can see a directory with direct links to our show. If none of those choices suit you, then know we have your back. We now have our very own app available on Google Play Store. It is a work in progress, but you can get to all of our shows by installing it on your Android device. iOS is in the works, but not ready yet. Today I'm going to be bringing you some of the variations of the world flood story from different cultures and parts of the world that you may have never heard. Now first though, a bit of warning up front for those that find that talk of religion and its deities is triggering. I will be keeping religion to as much of a minimum as necessary, but I would suggest that you just go ahead and skip this episode if you don't want to hear it. I do appreciate you tuning in each week, and we certainly don't want to offend, but sometimes facts, beliefs, and truths don't seem to see eye to eye for some people. And while I can appreciate that we are all different with different opinions on things, I feel that the discussing of God with a big G and gods with a little g is relevant to the historical context these cultures we will be taking a look at would have viewed their world. Also note that any opinions expressed may not be those of Before Midnight Studio or myself, but those of the historical figures I mentioned. If you're tuning out, then we hope to have you back next week. If you're sticking around, we will get to the program right after these words. Trippers, September is National Suicide Prevention Month, and we at the Road Tripping Podcast are dedicating a portion of our show for the entire month to assist in bringing awareness to the topic. We want you to know that we understand that every struggle is different, but there is hope. If you feel that you need someone to talk to, we encourage you to use the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, which provides 24/7 free and confidential support via phone or chat, as well as provide you with information on finding your local crisis center. Please call 1-800-273-TALK. That's 1-800-273-8255, or visit their website, suicidepreventionlifeline.org.
More leads, less effort. Sounds good, right? SocialBeat offers social media management tools, training, and teams to help you with content creations, posting, recycling, and more. Automatically post on all major networks. Organize your content into categories for the best content mix. Effortlessly repost your evergreen content for maximum impact. And save lots of time in the meantime. To help the show and get your 14-day free trial, follow the link in the show notes or by clicking on the banner on our homepage at theroadtrippingpodcast.com. We use them and think you should too. Join the hype today.
Disaster and catastrophe myths are quite common across all cultures around the globe. Of these, probably the most widespread is the flood myth. You can find it in all the world's top religions, as well as in the folklore of many native peoples. So that we're all on the same basic page, especially since the majority religion of the world's population is, according to Google, Christianity, I will briefly start with the story of Noah from the Christian Bible, as that will be the most familiar. Now, we'll be brief in the telling, but what I want you to focus on is not where the tale is coming from specifically, but the concepts of the story and the figure or figures involved, because the theme is very similar from story to story, which is the fascinating part. The Christian version can be found in the Bible, specifically in the book of Genesis, chapter 6, verse 9, through chapter 9, verse 17. But a summary goes like this. Noah was a righteous man and walked with God. Seeing that the earth was corrupt and filled with violence, God instructed Noah to build an ark in which he, his sons, and his wives, together with the male and female of all living creatures, would be saved from the waters. Noah entered the ark in his 600th year, and on the 17th day of the second month of that year, the fountains of the great deep burst apart and the floodgates of heaven broke open, and rain fell for 40 days and 40 nights, until the highest mountains were covered 15 cubits, and all earth-based life perished, except Noah and those with him in the ark. After 150 days, God remembered Noah, and the waters subsided, until the ark rested on the mountains of Ararat. On the 27th day of the second month of Noah's 601st year, the earth was dry. Then Noah built an altar and made a sacrifice. And God made a covenant with Noah that men would be allowed to eat every living thing, but not its blood, and that God would never again destroy all life by a flood. Now, a lot of Christian scholars will say that the story is purely a metaphor for salvation being only through the grace of God, which is true for Christians. However, with the story showing up in other cultures, one begins to have some inkling that something more is at play. To be fair, the tale of Noah is found in the Quran and is very similar to that of the Christian version, except of course Noah preached Islam and that Allah is all-knowing and seeks for loyalty and submission of one's entire self. The flood is a punishment for the unfaithful for not obeying, and there's no agreement between God and man that it would not happen again. In general, Islamic scholars are not interested in any symbolic meaning of the flood story, especially those put forth by Christians, so they take it as a literal fact. Now that we have the mainstream religious version of the tale out in the open, we can move to those of other cultures which you will see are often very, very similar in the overall theme of the one I just told you from the Bible. So I'm going to start at what is thought to be the beginning. Of all the legends of a great flood recorded in literature, the oldest is said to be the Sumerian tale that we get from the Babylonians, who lived in the ancient kingdom of Mesopotamia between the 18th and 6th century BC, so nearly 4,000 years ago. Now just a heads up from here on out. A lot of the cultures, like the Babylonians, were polytheistic, meaning they had many little g gods, so be warned. Their tale goes something like this. During the reign of Xisothrus, the 10th king of Babylon, the god Kronos appeared to him in a dream and warned him that all men would be destroyed by a flood on the 15th day of the month Dacius, which was the 8th month of the Macedonian calendar. Then Kronos commanded him to write a history of the world from the beginning and to bury it for safety in Sippar, the city of the sun. Moreover, he was to build a ship and place aboard it his kinfolks and friends, stores of meat and drink, animals both foul and four-footed, and when he was ready, he was to set sail. And when he asked, "And whither shall I sail?" the god answered him, "To the gods, but first thou shalt pray for all good things to men." So he obeyed and built the ship. It was, assuming the word furlong means the same here as the current distance of measure, the length was 5 furlongs or 3,300 feet, and the breadth of it was 2 furlongs or 1,320 feet, which would be over 3 times as large as an American Nimitz-class aircraft carrier. And when he gathered all things together, he stored them in the ship and embarked his children and friends. And when the flood had come and gone, Xisothrus let fly some of the birds he had brought aboard. But as they could not find food nor a place to rest, they came back to the ship. Some days later, Xisothrus set out the birds again, and when they returned to the ship, their feet were covered in clay. Sometime later, he sent them out a third time, and they did not return, letting Xisothrus come to the conclusion that the land was now above the water. So he parted some of the seams of the ship and went ashore with his wife, his daughter, and the helmsman, taking time to worship the ground, build an altar, and make a sacrifice to the gods in gratitude for their survival. He, his wife, and daughter, and the helmsman then disappeared. When those who had remained in the ship saw he wasn't coming back, they disembarked and looked for them, but they were nowhere to be seen. Xisothrus' voice came from the air and told them not to fear the gods, because if they were pious as he himself had been, they would go on to dwell with the gods too. He commanded them to return to Babylon and dig up the scriptures which he had buried, then distribute them among men. Sounds remarkably familiar, doesn't it? Another factoid for you that draws parallels with the biblical tale is that the ark landed in what they knew and referred to at the time as Armenia. And if you look at the early translations of biblical text, you will find that when translated from Latin, you get that the ark came to rest on the peaks of the mountains of Ararat. But the wording says literally, and the ark rested on the mountains of Armenia. Now I want to move to some cultures who have a flood myth that is completely different from what we are discussing up to this point. So stay tuned after this promo trailer from today's show partner.
Hello and welcome to the History Obscura podcast. This is the place where history's forgotten secrets are unshelved from my vast, firelit book repository and reintroduced to the world. Learn stories of space exploration, medieval royals, smugglers, martyrs, and monsters. Subscribe to History Obscura for a fresh tale every Saturday and Tuesday night.
The first tale I want to point you to comes from Australia, courtesy of the Aborigines of Victoria. It goes like this. Many long ages ago, the creator Bundell was very angry with black people because they had done evil. So, in his fury, he caused the ocean to swell, and in the rising waters all black people were drowned, except those who Bundell loved. Those he caught up from the rising water and fixed as stars in the sky. Despite everything, a man and a woman escaped by climbing a high tree on a mountain. They then became the ancestors of the human race. While there's nothing about the ark or animals, there's still the concept of the saving of a man and a woman to repopulate the earth, just like the tales I've already described. Here's one from the Valmains of Berlin Harbor on the northern coast of New Guinea that has multiple parts of the story very similar to the biblical tale. One day, the wife of a very good man saw a great fish swimming to the bank. She called to her husband, but at first he could not see the fish. So his wife laughed at him and hid him behind a banana tree that he might peep at it through the leaves. When he did catch sight of it at last, he was horribly afraid, and sending for his family, a son and 2 daughters, he forbade them to catch and eat the fish. But the other people took bow and arrow and a cord, and they caught the fish and drew it to land. Though the good man warned them not to eat of the fish, they did it anyway. When the good man saw that, he hastily drove a pair of animals of every sort up into the trees, and then he and his family climbed up into a coconut tree. Hardly had the wicked men consumed the fish than water burst from the ground with such violence that nobody had time to save himself. Men and animals were all drowned. When the water had mounted to the top of the highest tree, it sank as rapidly as it had risen. Then the good man came down from the tree with his family and laid out new plantations. So in this tale, we see the saving of a pair of animals as well as a man and a woman. Also, the flooding is due to the wickedness of man's actions, which again draws back to the same biblical tales. These aren't just on the other side of the planet either. The indigenous people of the United States have a wide variety of tales about the topic. For instance, the Zuni of New Mexico relate that once upon a time, a great flood forced them to flee their village in the valley and take refuge on a high plateau with steep sides of red and white sandstone. The waters rose nearly to the summit of the plateau, so to appease the angry water, the Indians, fearing to be swept off the face of the earth, resolved to offer a human sacrifice. A young man and woman were chosen, the children of 2 priests of the rain. They were then dressed in their finest of robes and beads, and thrown into the swelling flood. Immediately the waters began to recede, and the youth and maiden were turned into stone. They claim that you may still see them in the form of 2 great pinnacles of rock rising from the plateau. Stories of a great flood are widely spread among Indians of the Algonquin as well, and they resemble each other in some details. Thus the Delawares, which are an Algonquin tribe, and whose home was about Delaware Bay, told of a deluge which submerged the whole earth, and from which few persons escaped alive. They saved themselves by taking refuge on the back of a turtle, which was so old that its shell was mossy like the bank of a river. As they were floating, a loon flew their way, and they begged him to dive and bring up land from the depth of the waters. The bird dived accordingly, but could find no bottom. Then he flew far away and came back with a little earth in his bill. Guided by him, the turtle swam to the place where some dry land was found. There they settled and repopulated the country. So here's the last one I'm going to talk about on today's show because I am up against the time frame we have been trying to establish for our shows, but I will give you where to find more stories when I'm done. The Hareskin Indians say that a wise man once upon a time resolved to build a great raft. Here's our ark. When his sister, who was also his wife, here's the family connection now, asked him why he would build it, he said, "If there comes a flood as I foresee, we shall take refuge on the raft." He told his plan to other men on the earth, but they laughed at him, saying, "If there is a flood, we shall take refuge on the trees." Here's the same point where other men had scoffed at Noah in the biblical tale. Nevertheless, the wise men made a great raft, joining the logs together by a rope made of roots. All of a sudden there came a flood such that the like of it had never been seen before. The water seemed to gush forth on every side. Men climbed up the trees, but the water rose after them, and they were all drowned. The wise man floated safely on his strong and well-corded raft. As he floated, he thought of the future, and he gathered by twos all the herbivorous animals, and all the birds, and even all the beasts of prey he met with on his passage. So here he is gathering all the animals, just like, again, in the biblical tale. "Come up on my raft," he said to them, "for soon there will be no more earth." Indeed, the earth disappeared under the water, and for a long time nobody thought of going to look for it. The first to plunge into the depth was a muskrat, but he could find no bottom, and when he bobbed up on the surface again, he was half drowned. "There is no earth," said he. A second time he dived, and when he came up he said, "I smelt the smell of the earth, but I could not reach it." Next it came to the turn of the beaver. He dived and remained a long time under water. At last he reappeared, floating on his back, breathless and unconscious. But in his paw he had a little mud, which he gave to the wise man. The wise man placed the mud on the water, breathed on it, and said, "I would there were an earth again." At the same time he breathed on the handful of mud, and lo, it began to grow. He put a small bird on it, and the patch of mud grew still bigger. So he breathed, and the mud grew and grew. Then the man put a fox on the floating island of mud, and the fox ran around it in a single day. Round and round the island ran the fox, and bigger grew the island. 6 times did the fox make the circuit of the island, but when he made it for the 7th time, the land was complete, even as it was before the flood. Then the wise man caused all the animals to disembark and landed them on the dry ground. Afterwards he himself disembarked with his wife and son, saying, "It is for us that this earth shall be repeopled." And repeopled it was, sure enough. Only one difficulty remained with which the wise man had to grapple. The floods were still out, and how to reduce them was the question. The bittern saw the difficulty and came to the rescue. He swallowed the whole of the water, and then lay like a log on the bank, with his belly swollen to a frightful size. This was more than the wise man had bargained for. If there had been too much water before, there was too little now. In his embarrassment, the wise man had recourse to the plover. "The bittern," he said, "is lying yonder in the sun with his belly full of water. Pierce it." So the artful plover made up to the unsuspecting bittern. "My grandmother," said he, in a sympathizing tone, "has no doubt a pain in her stomach." And he passed his hands softly over the ailing part of the bittern as if to soothe it. But suddenly he put out his claws and clawed the swollen stomach of the bittern. Such a scratch he gave it. There was a gurgling sound, and out came the water from the stomach, bubbling and foaming. It flowed away into rivers and lakes, and thus the world became habitable once more. Trippers, I hope you found that the few tales that I covered as fascinating as I do. The whole concept of a worldwide flood is just mind-boggling anyway, but to find so many stories that seem to follow along the same plot line from across the planet, when mainstream archaeologists say that worldwide communication wouldn't have been possible, seems to suggest that something else may have been at play, like the events actually happened and weren't just a story. There's even been some scientific exploration on the subject that has come out in the last 20 years that support the hypothesis it happened. I will drop some of those links in the show notes for you to explore yourself. If you want to read these tales and many more for yourself, I highly recommend today's source material, The Great Flood, a handbook of world flood myth by Sir James G. Fraser. I picked up the Kindle edition for $2.99 on Amazon, so it's not a bank breaker. This book is packed with stories that I guarantee you will enjoy if you are intrigued by the topic. Well, that's all the time we have for in this episode of the Road Tripping Podcast. But if you liked it and want to hear more, please subscribe to the show feed and give us a 5-star rating on your favorite podcast directory. The more positive reviews we receive, the more trippers will be able to find us, and the faster we will grow, thus being able to bring you new content. Be sure to visit our website, theroadtrippingpodcast.com, that's tripping with a G, to keep updated on future shows, leave show suggestions, and see all the ways to find and interact with us all in one place. If you are able and feeling generous, then a link to our Patreon page can be found under the support link on the homepage. We've been your hosts, Dean Ward and Molly Malloy, and the Road Tripping Podcast is recorded and produced at Before Midnight Studio. As always, until next we meet, stay safe, trippers.